What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about how I approach making builds in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Now, as someone who has covered the game rather extensively, this is a question I will get every once in a while, just kind of asking about my approach to making these builds. And just recently, I was working on a build that, unfortunately, due to a bugged class feature, I couldn't go forward with, and while I was wondering what I could do with that footage to try to make something productive out of it, I decided to go ahead and make this video kind of explaining my process. So first things first, and this might surprise some people, I don't do spreadsheets. I find that once I get to that level of trying to min-max something or laying it out all on paper, I feel like I'm just not having fun at that point, so I do pretty much everything in-game actually. And believe it or not, the very first thing I do is I start in character creation. As someone who's covered this game a lot, I actually did a series of videos covering all of the class mechanics for each class ahead of the release. And so that by itself kind of gave me a lot of knowledge of what you can expect from basically every class, which honestly helps a lot with this part of the process, because basically what I'm doing in character creation here is, to begin with, pick a class and an archetype that I find interesting. So my goal right now is to eventually just make builds for every class, or at least something interesting, and do at least one per class. So in this particular instance, I settled on Arcanist. There are a couple popular builds for Arcanist, such as the Brown Fur Transmuter. There are some things you can do with Mythic Paths that make that particularly strong if you build into it, and because of that, I knew that I didn't want to do Brown Fur Transmuter. And the single most interesting Arcanist archetype to me is Eldritch Font. Now, in order to understand the benefits of Eldritch Font, you have to understand how Arcanists actually work, because they are simultaneously prepared and spontaneous casters, which I realize means nothing to newcomers, but basically Arcanists will get prepared spell slots. However, those spell slots don't actually dictate how many times they can cast their spells. It just dictates what spells they get to cast spontaneously for that day, which is a middle ground between prepared and spontaneous, and it's a little weird. So Eldritch Font takes that a bit farther with Font of Power. This will allow them to cast their spells one more time per day, or one additional time. However, it reduces the number of spells they can prepare by one as well. However, if this would reduce the spell they could prepare to 0, then they still get 1 regardless. And then later, at level 3, they pick up what is called Eldritch Surge. Now this is the ability that was actually bugged a little bit, which I discovered during the testing phase, and we'll talk a bit more about it at that point, which is right after character creation. But to summarize, in character creation, I look for something interesting, something that I feel like I don't see a lot of people do, and just try to find ways to make it unique. Now, while I'm actually at the class selection screen, the second thing I do here is identify what I like to refer to as dead levels. Other people might have another term for it, whatever, but basically these are levels that this class gets that don't really do anything. Now, in this particular example, this doesn't really come up because spellcasters, you ideally don't want to multi-class them because it might mess with their spell progression. A much less common thing to do there. But for other types of classes like melees, people who don't get full spellcasting progression, that is to say they don't get 9th level spells, I identify levels I'm not going to use, which more often than not is the last 2 to 3 levels a class will get. And then from here, I do the rest of character creation. I basically do a mock-up of everything I would do for that character as a start. So what race am I going to pick? One of the key things to look at here is what bonuses is that race going to give to your stats? And does that outweigh the extra feat you get by being a human? So humans are actually fantastic for min-maxing simply because they get an extra feat. And because you can raise your stats through items, more often than not, being a human tends to have more value simply for that extra feat, unless you're playing a class that doesn't need as many feats as a lot of classes do. And then for backgrounds, which is actually a bit new to Wrath of the Righteous in terms of the video games, what I'm looking for here is how I can get the biggest bonuses to my character. Now, backgrounds can give you proficiencies, they can add class skills to your list of class skills, and a variety of other bonuses. However, the other thing to keep in mind here is that if your character already has those class skills, or they already have the proficiency the background would give them, then they instead get a +1 bonus, either enhancement or competence bonus, to that particular thing. And that can actually be very strong if you don't find a background that would benefit you in other ways. But truthfully, the bonuses from backgrounds tend to be so minor, it's never really like a deciding factor in what I'm doing. Now, stats can be a little more complicated, that is to say, your ability points. So obviously each class has the thing that they lean into, but as an example, for the Arcanist here, they actually have 3 that are recommended, which is Dex, Intelligence, and Charisma. Now, I know, because I play this a lot, that dexterity and intelligence are the important ones there. While the Arcanist uses charisma a lot for their class features, such as their Arcanist exploits, it's worth mentioning that what the charisma actually does is affect the number of rounds their exploits and things work through. So while it is definitely helpful, it's not the most important stat, actually, and you'll want a little bit of it, but not necessarily as much as you can possibly get, because again, this can be augmented through items and things later in the game. And then for skills, I usually just use whatever class skills are going to give me the biggest bonuses. And then from there, we pick things like our feats. Now, depending on exactly what you're doing, all of this is going to change a great deal, at least to character creation. But basically, my goal here is using my knowledge of the Pathfinder system, I make the best level 1 version of whatever I'm trying to do, just to give me a good jumping off point, get an idea of what I want to do. My next phase from here is to actually hire this same character as a mercenary, and then level them all the way up to 20, and then take a look at what I want to do with them in terms of feats and choices in general. So as you can see here, I have this level 20 Arcanist Eldritch font, and what I did is went through and picked all of the feats and things that I want at each level, and I kind of play around with that a little bit, decide what's going to be best win, that type of thing. Now, a key thing to note here is that I have not used any gear or anything like that. I'm just looking at what I can do as I level this character up. In fact, I might need to do this a couple of times as I change things, kind of look at how picking up certain feats at certain times is going to affect certain things, that type of stuff. And in this particular instance, what I settled on was primarily switching around 2 sets of spell focus and greater spell focus, because this class was meant to focus around illusion and evocation. So what I was planning on determining during the testing phase is when it was best to pick up each version. Basically, phase 2 is just kind of doing mock level ups, deciding what feats I need when, and then from here we move into actually testing the base build. Now, I haven't even gotten into Mythic Paths yet. I usually do that last. We'll talk about it later. Because between phase 2 and phase 3, I usually do some bouncing around. Because phase 3, for me, is actually testing the build. Now, I actually do 2 types of testing. Modded testing with 0 equipment, and then actual game testing. The modded testing with no equipment serves one purpose, and one purpose only, and that is purely to make sure everything I want to do with the build actually works. This is where I discovered the bug for the Arcanist build that functionally made it useless. So basically what I'll do is I'll have my character, I will use mods to then spawn enemies that don't fight back in any way, just passive enemies. And then from here, I will use that character I just made to then test all of their class mechanics and synergies and make sure things are working. So for this Arcanist build, to give the example here, at later levels, their Eldritch Surge turns into Improved and Greater Surge. And unfortunately, in this testing phase, I found that absolutely no part of Eldritch Surge works correctly. Now, the first part you could argue is an implementation difference. So Arcanists get Arcanist exploits, which allow them to change their magic in various ways, which makes them a fun spellcaster to mess around with. And one of the best and most basic Arcanist exploits you can pick up is called Potent Magic, which will let you increase your either caster level or the DC of the spell you're about to cast by 1. Now, normally, Arcanists can use their Arcane Reservoir, which is the points by which they can use their Arcanist exploits, to do this anyway. However, Potent Magic doubles that bonus, so they can effectively raise this by 2 instead of the normal 1. So Potent Magic is an Arcanist exploit that can give your Arcanist a lot of power right out of the gate by letting them cast higher DC and higher caster level spells. Now, this differs from what Eldritch Surge is supposed to do, because Eldritch Surge is supposed to do both of those things at the same time, at the cost of fatiguing your character. So instead of choosing caster level or DC, Eldritch Surge is supposed to do both of those things, but then after this, your character is fatigued, and if they're already fatigued, they then become exhausted. Now, the implementation that we have in-game is that Eldritch Surge still actually only does one or the other, but it does it by 2 at a base, which means you don't need to pick up the Arcanist exploit of Potent Magic. Now, you could, again, argue that's purely an implementation decision on Owlcat Games' part. Fair enough. However, the improved and greater surge variants simply do not work. So at later levels, you get an option under Eldritch Surge to actually do 2 attack rolls and then pick the better one whenever you cast a spell that uses an attack roll. Now, this is actually important for certain types of ray magic, or basically any magic that shoots a projectile. You will actually make a range touch attack roll. So you could use the Surge ability to make sure that your attacks have a better chance of going through. And then the Greater Surge actually acts as a sort of persistent meta magic, but as a class feature. Greater Surge allows you to augment the next spell you cast to force the creature you are attacking to re-roll a successful saving throw against your spell, which is exactly what persistent meta magic does. And in testing, I found that neither of these things worked. You will not roll that second attack roll, and enemies will not re-roll their successful saving throws at all. Now, I discovered this by actually being curious and asking myself a question of whether or not Greater Surge was going to stack with persistent meta magic. Because I was like, if this is basically persistent meta magic, I'm curious if using both Greater Surge and a persistent meta magic spell would force them to re-roll several times. In my initial testing, I found that it didn't work, or at least that it didn't stack, but the persistent meta magic from the spell went through. So then I tested a non-meta magic version, and it didn't even re-roll that, which is how I discovered the bug. And then I tested the attack rolls, found that that wasn't working, which is basically how I discovered that the entirety of the Eldritch Surge archetype power just does not work. This is all said to highlight the fact that the unmodded class mechanics feature testing, whatever you want to call it here, is probably the most important step, because it's just a matter of making sure everything is working correctly. And then the second phase of testing is where I move into actually testing at various parts of the game. Now, this part is the single most time-consuming part of the entire bit. So basically what I will do is, first things first, I will run through the entirety of Act 1 with this character at the actual difficulty I plan on making this for. So in most cases, I make my builds for core difficulty. As a bit above that, you start having to cheese a lot of stuff. But for the most part, I shoot for core. So I'll run through Act 1, which I've done it so many times, it takes me a couple hours tops. And then from there, in each of the subsequent acts of the game, I will hire a mercenary usually, grab all the equipment I can from that appropriate act that is appropriate for this character, and then I will test and make sure that they are actually combat efficient against at least most things. Now, this is the part that actually takes a while, because having to do that for each and every act, outside of like the end game, does just frankly take a while. Now, as I mentioned, we have not even talked about Mythic Paths yet. This is because this is the very last thing I do. Due to the nature of the Mythic Paths, a lot of times builds will have specific Mythic Paths that work a lot better than others. For instance, in this particular case, for the Arcanist, it is just purely the Lich. Lich is the best option for that by far, simply because you can merge your spellbook, which will then give you access to level 10 spells. Combine this with the Lich's abilities like Deadly Magic, etc., and Lich, it's not even a close call as to what you would want to use for this Arcanist build I was working on. It was Lich all the way. But my goal here for the Mythic Path is basically to just find a Mythic Path that complements the complete build I already made. I personally do not like actually making builds that are completely dependent on Mythic Path stuff or abilities, but rather that the Mythic Path just makes the build that much better is usually my goal. And honestly, I usually spend the least amount of time on picking the Mythic Path, just because the nature of the Mythic Paths tend to make the choice pretty obvious. And combine that with the fact that the Mythic Paths actually change the gameplay a substantial amount, I usually try to leave that as open as possible, or give people other options. But in some cases, there is just an obvious winner, unless you just specifically don't want to roleplay as that. But there you go, guys. It was a little on the long-winded side. I hope people enjoyed it, though, found some insight in it, but this is basically just the process I go through when I work on these Wrath of the Righteous builds. It is why they take me quite a while, actually, specifically the testing. And while luckily I do have just tons of save files that I can just load up and do a lot of this stuff fairly quickly in, it's still usually going to take several hours at the very least, depending really on the complexity of the build itself. But nonetheless, I hope everybody enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.